In this video, I'm going to cover Chapter 3, Section 4, which is over the fallacies of ambiguity. The common theme in 3.4 is that each of these errors in reasoning are all, in some sense, ambiguous, meaning that simply they're less than clear. And of course, in logical thinking and logical reasoning, we need to be able to use language precisely and clearly. If there's anything ambiguous about the statement that we're attempting to make, then we've committed a logical fallacy. So the first one on the list, I'm actually going to cluster together two overlapping concepts, and they really do again go hand in hand, begging the question, circular reasoning. And begging the question might actually be the trickiest one, not just of 3.4, but maybe the trickiest one of the section, in fact. The concept is straightforward enough, but it's actually, again, a pretty tricky one to spot. So let's start with the concept, and then I'll try to clarify it by way of example. So in the logical fallacy, begging the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove. You, again, assume the very thing you're trying to prove. And when I put it just that way in straightforward terms, this obviously is fallacious. It's not at all fair to go around assuming things, and it's certainly not fair to assume the very thing you're trying to establish. An obvious point, clearly fallacious, but again, easier said than done. So let's go through a fairly controversial example. I'm going to start premise one with a claim that hopefully we can accept as being true without any real discussion. So premise one, I'm going to claim that murder is wrong. And again, hopefully we can just accept this as, in fact, being a true statement without any additional discussion being necessary. If you're not convinced by the claim that murder in cold blood, mind you, is wrong, then I would encourage you to take Philosophy 215 on ethics. Philosophy 215 is offered in the fall and in the spring. And the class actually only meets Monday through Thursday, so you never ever have to come to class on Friday, and a 3-day weekend every weekend. Pretty sweet deal. So murder is wrong. And let me actually just cut straight to my conclusion here. Based on my evidence, murder is wrong. I want to claim, therefore, and here's the controversial part, abortion is wrong. And many people are inclined to take this argument at face value, and murder is wrong, I agree. Therefore, it's got to be the case that abortion is wrong. But this argument is clearly an example of begging the question. There is an underlying assumption. There is, in fact, a missing premise that I've just assumed without any further discussion or clarification whatsoever. The missing line here, my unwritten assumption, premise 1.5, if I try to squeeze that in, would be that abortion is murder. And if you're at all familiar with the abortion debate, this really becomes the entire discussion. Is, in fact, abortion murder? If it is murder, if we can establish that, and establishing that, of course, really involves pinpointing the exact moment when life begins. If we can establish that abortion is, in fact, murder, then, of course, abortion is wrong. Why? Because, well, murder is wrong. But again, obviously enough, I can't just assume this to be the case and then conclude abortion is wrong. Here, I'm assuming the very thing, really, that I'm attempting to establish. And again, that's a classic example of begging the question. So notice again, in this list of 8, I've clustered together begging the question with circular reasoning. So circular reasoning, if this distinction turns out to be worthwhile, occurs when, as the name pretty clearly indicates, you reason in a circle. Thus the name, circular reasoning. Pretty logical, huh? So all arguments, series of premises followed by a conclusion. So in a circular argument, your conclusion is actually also the premise of an argument. Let's suppose, in this case, it's actually premise one. And so it's a circular argument, and that you're just reasoning in a big circle. Should go without saying that the conclusion of your argument can't also serve as evidence to support itself. In philosophy, this is sometimes referred to as bootstrapping, quote-unquote bootstrapping. It's as though you're going to reach down and grab your bootstraps and then physically lift yourself up off the ground, which of course can't really physically be done. And likewise, you can't use the conclusion as a premise as well, as supporting evidence. This is, again, circular reasoning. And so let me give you a pretty common example. This one from Philosophy of Religion, Philosophy 220. Many people are inclined to reason as follows. I believe that the Bible is true because God wrote it. I believe that the Bible is true because God wrote it. Okay, great. Well, why do you believe in God? Because of the Bible. And notice here, you've reasoned in one big circle. I believe the Bible is true because God wrote it, and I believe in God because of the Bible. This is a classic example of circular reasoning. So one down, which really kind of became two, which leaves us with 7 more to go. But number 2 on the list, actually, is quite easy. It's known as a complex question. A complex question. And the dead giveaway on a complex question is that, well, it poses a question. Now, of course, not all questions clearly are fallacious. It's only a fallacious question if it turns out to be complex. So what's the idea behind a complex question? A complex question assumes something that hasn't yet been established. It assumes something that hasn't been established. So let me give you an example here. We might say something like this. Have you stopped cheating on logic tests? Have you stopped cheating on your logic test? And notice, either way you try to answer this, you've actually you've conceded to something that hasn't been granted. So you can either respond by saying, yes, in fact, I have stopped cheating. Well, now that seems to suggest that in the past you were cheating on your logic test, which is probably not what you actually want to say, but now you've stopped all that. And if you respond in a negative fashion, no, I've not stopped cheating on my logic test, this seems to suggest that you were cheating and you still continue to cheat. So the underlying assumption, and the very way that I phrased the question, the underlying assumption is that at some point you were in fact cheating. This is a complex question. It assumes something that hasn't been established. And if somebody tries to trap you with a question like this, the best response is to say, oh, well, that question is in fact fallacious. Don't try to answer it, but rather point out the mistake in reasoning. So next up on the list, number 3, in no particular order really, just following the order of the section, of the text that is what's called a false dichotomy. And some texts, I've noted, again here this parenthetically, some texts refer to this as a false dilemma. So 2 different ways really of saying the same thing. A false dichotomy, otherwise known as a false dilemma. A false dilemma, or dichotomy, falsely limits the options to just 2, when in fact there are others. So you'll see something like either A or B, your choice, you pick. Well, that becomes fallacious when I ignore the excluded middle. What about option C? If C is a legit alternative, then I can't falsely limit the possibilities to just 2, either A or B, when in fact there are others. And of course, as you might imagine, just as we could have a false dilemma, we could also have a false trilemma, falsely limiting the options to just 3, when in fact there are others? What about D? Or we could have a false quad lemma for that matter. What about E? So on and so forth. The important point here is that you can't falsely limit the options. And let me make one other last point perfectly clear here. Not all dilemmas are false. Just because the word or is present, just because somebody says A or B, it doesn't automatically make it a false dilemma. Not all dilemmas, again, are false. It's only a false dilemma if you falsely limit the options. Some dilemmas are actually real dilemmas. In some cases, that is, there are only 2 legit options. So number 4 on the list, suppressed evidence. Suppressed evidence. And number 1 on our list and number 4 on our list, begging the question and suppressed evidence, kind of actually go hand in hand. And if I had to rank them in terms of the difficulty in spotting them, these would really be 1A and 1B. So the name here, suppressed evidence, gives it away. It's a fallacy where you suppress the evidence. You don't actually provide all the evidence. There's a missing bit of information that, if present, if it weren't suppressed or just flat out missing altogether, would lead you to a very different conclusion. So here's an obvious example of suppressed evidence. I might reason that since it's safe to go up and pet most dogs after all are friendly, that it's therefore probably okay to pet this dog. And notice again that the argument is inductive. It's safe to pet most dogs, so therefore it's probably safe to pet this dog. And this could be suppressed evidence if I neglect to mention that this particular dog happens to be foaming at the mouth. That's some pretty important information that I've excluded. And if I were to tell you that this dog is foaming at the mouth, we'd arrive at a pretty different conclusion, wouldn't we? Therefore, it's probably not safe to actually pet this dog. This dog, in fact, might very well have rabies, as the case might be. So suppressed evidence, missing evidence, evidence that's suppressed, that's just not there. And the tricky thing about suppressed evidence, about spotting suppressed evidence, is that you've got to have some general background information. Otherwise, you wouldn't be aware that evidence is missing. And of course, as is the case for all of these, you'll get a good opportunity to practice by going through a series of examples in the text. So the next 2, equivocation and amphibole. These 2 go hand in hand, 5 and 6 go nicely together, and are actually, fair warning, often confused. It's easy to think that amphibole is an equivocation and vice versa. So they go hand in hand, but it'll be kind of tricky to get a clear distinction between the 2. This is something that will come with practice. And then 7 and 8, likewise, kind of go hand in hand as a pair. If you get one down, the other falls nicely into place. So let's tackle these together. Equivocation versus amphibole. And of course, as always, I'll be sure to give you some good, clean examples to think about. So first of all, an equivocation occurs when the definition of a key term changes in the middle of an argument. So let's just lay out a sample argument, series of premises, followed by a conclusion. So again, the key for an equivocation, as opposed to amphibole to come, is that it hinges on the definition of a single term changing right in the middle of an argument. So let's say premise 1, it need not be the first premise, of course, but somewhere early in the argument, you use a key term, X. Fancy bit of jargon. And by X here, maybe you even go so far as to clearly define it, so as to avoid a fallacy of ambiguity. Again, you need to use language clearly and precisely. So you want to avoid a fallacy of ambiguity, you offer up a formal definition. By X, I really mean Y. So far, so good. Great. No fallacy here whatsoever. In fact, defining your terms, and often a good thing to do. But here's the equivocation aspect. Suppose later in the argument, line 3, you use that same term X, which has been defined as y, but now all of a sudden, without any clarification, by x, you now mean z. And so based on the new definition of x, you now draw your conclusion. And again, these are all obvious concepts when I lay them out in such a fashion. Are you allowed to change the definition of a key term right in the middle of your argument and then draw your conclusion based on an equivocation? And this sometimes is referred to commonly as a weasel word. Well, it's obviously fallacious and not fair to do. Amphibole. Amphibole occurs when the very construction of the sentence itself is grammatically ambiguous. So in an equivocation, the definition of the term changes, whereas in amphibole, the grammatical construction of the sentence is ambiguous. It's unclear. So let's start with a fairly clean example of an equivocation now that hopefully you've kind of got the formal definition down. And this example is straight out of the text. It's section 4 of chapter 3, of course, and problem number 10. If Thomas gives Marie a ring, then Thomas and Marie will be engaged. Thomas did give Marie a ring. In fact, he phoned her just the other night. Therefore, Thomas and Marie are engaged. This is a pretty silly but clean example of an equivocation. The term that's being equivocated is ring. Ring, of course, has multiple definitions. The first definition of a ring is that of a wedding ring. If Thomas gives Marie a wedding ring, then they'll be engaged, or an engagement ring, I suppose I should say. The second definition of ring is to call somebody up, to ring their phone. So we've got an equivocation on ring. It's defined as an engagement ring, and then phoning somebody up, giving them a ring. Therefore, they're engaged. Pretty silly example, but an obvious equivocation on the word ring. Now compare and contrast that, and again these two are easily confused, with amphibole, a grammatically ambiguous sentence. You can interpret it in a couple of different ways, and it's really unclear what's actually meant by the sentence. So this, again, straight out of the text, 3.4, number 15. George said that he was interviewing for a job drilling oil wells in the supervisor's office. We can only conclude that the supervisor must have an awfully dirty office. Ha ha ha. But notice, again, that it's grammatically ambiguous. You can interpret this in a couple of different ways. The obvious interpretation, what no doubt the author meant, was that the interview was taking place in the supervisor's office, which of course would make perfect sense. But we could also interpret this as the job really being about drilling wells in an office. And if we're drilling oil wells especially in the supervisor's office, then the supervisor must have an awfully dirty office. Ha ha. But the point being, the sentence is grammatically ambiguous. We can't really tell what it means. Now, of course, common sense, again, would lead us to the conclusion that the interview was in the job and not that the job was drilling in the office itself. But certainly we shouldn't rely on common sense of the reader. Again, the whole gist in 3.4 is to use language clearly and precisely so as to avoid these all too common mistakes. So we're down to one last pair here in 3.4. Composition versus division. Composition versus division. And I get one down, the other's piece of cake here. So two more to go, but won't take as much time. Fairly quick and easy, actually. So composition versus division. Composition, in composition, you're reasoning from part to whole. You're reasoning that because the parts are this way, the whole thing's got to be that way. And division, it's just the reverse. You reason that since the whole is this way, well, all the parts have to have that characteristic as well. Part to whole, that's composition. Whole to part, that's division. And of course, let me give you a couple of cheesy examples here to clarify the point. Let's start with number 7, composition, part to whole. I like pickles. I also like ice cream. Therefore, I must like pickles and ice cream blended together. And that actually sounds kind of disgusting, in fact. Just because the parts have a certain characteristic, I like pickles, I also like ice cream. It doesn't mean that the whole would be that way. Pickles and ice cream blended together, again, sounds pretty disgusting. Part to whole, this is often fallacious. Hold apart, because the whole thing's that way, each part must be that way. So here again is another generic but clean example. The puzzle, when you put all the pieces together, takes the shape of a circle. So the whole's this way. The whole, when you put all the pieces together, is in the form of a circle, the shape of the circle. So therefore, I'd like to conclude that each piece of the puzzle, each puzzle part, is in the shape of a circle, which of course doesn't necessarily follow. Just because the whole's that way, it doesn't follow that the parts are that way. And again, let me be clear. Just because you see this style of reasoning, either composition, part to whole, or division, whole to part, doesn't automatically mean that it's fallacious. In chapter 3, the informal fallacies, it centers around the content. You're spotting the pattern in reasoning, part to whole to part, and these examples, but the content here is what's important. Just because it's part to whole doesn't automatically mean it's fallacious. It should set off some alarm bells. Aha, this might be composition, but you've got to examine the content closely.